I'm like, this is the end. My eyes. Why isn't it shutting down?
Face swap with David.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Did you see it?
Wow.
Although it doesn't really look like him on my face.
Oh, wait, are you mixed?
Well, good morning. What, we've got 3 classes left? Something like that? About 3 classes. That's one of the things that Hermione says that I just can't imagine being able to say. That's when she says, but I don't like flying. I can't do it.
That.
But I bet you could.
Yeah.
So, what I planned for today, and I have another one later on, next week actually, would be presentations that I had done. This one was for the OLE classes.
Oh, I know what the OLE.
The OLE classes are for folks that aren't dead yet, but close, for the most part. And no, I'm just kidding. But who are interested in continuing to learn. They do pay for the classes, and there's really quite an interesting list of classes that are available. The money doesn't go to the people that teach the classes, it goes to run the OLE program. In fact, we have some classes here. Ron Crawford teaches OLE classes for those that are interested in the different movies. He's really into movies and analyzing them and so on. Which, by the way, if you ever hear the entire top floor of the building shaking, it's usually because he has the speakers of that Crawford Theater up so loud that that's what's rattling the whole place. That room has been specially designed according to his specifications, just so it does that. But this particular program, a group of us had organized to do this so that each of the lectures was done by a different person. I did the one on monotheism. Reverend Gay gave one on Protestantism. Dr. Kristen Hansen gave one on Confucianism. We had another professor did one on Buddhism. Dr. Morakade did one on atheism. So we had a lot of different individuals, each taking a particular topic and presenting it. By the way, Dr. Hansen is presenting her new book this evening at 5 o'clock at the college bookstore from 5 to 7. So if you have a chance to go, her book is about translating Inupiaq culture into Protestant Christian scripture or something. I'll find out tonight. Actually, I've seen the emails, but she's a retired nurse, and also her specialty, she has her PhD in philosophy of religion. And for years now, she's been teaching the philosophy of religion, or the Western and Eastern religion classes for UAA, for our philosophy department. And so she's presenting her book. It just got published this evening. And if you're in the area, a whole bunch of us are going to be attending her book presentation, but then we're all going to leave early, just before the question and answer period, because we also have another professor from Norway or some Norwegian place who's going to be doing a presentation on John Locke and his theory of time. So if you're, I posted the poster on Facebook. If you're a Facebook friend, you saw it maybe. However, So this evening we'll be busy with lots of interesting stuff to do. Probably food at both places, which means, cookies and crappy juice or something, how they do. But so my presentation I gave to a large group. I mean, we had one of the big auditoriums in the Rasmussen Hall for this, and I think we had something like 60 or so people signed up for it. And I assumed that they would all be, as I said, older people that were very, very literate, had been reading lots of things about philosophy and religion, and so I took a tack that I thought would really interest them, and I was totally wrong, because it turned out that most of the people that I felt for sure every one of them would have been familiar with, they had no clue. They didn't know them, like Richard Dawkins and others of that sort. And plus I started it off with the Conan the Barbarian song, from that movie. Or it's not actually from the movie Conan, but it's instead that spoof on Conan, where he's, got that imitator singing, what is good, killing your enemies, see them, running before you and hearing the lamentations of their women, etc. That's, So I played that for them, and they all just sat there looking at it in horror, because they had they apparently hadn't seen the movie, didn't know that it was a spoof on anything, and plus what I ended up also discovering was they all needed hearing aids of some sort, and the room really didn't have any great amplification set up, so they really couldn't hear what was going on. And I don't think they could read what I had on the screen either, so it was a disaster, basically, for me. But fortunately, all the others, I warned all the others about my experience, and all the others gave presentations that were really aimed at what I discovered about the audience, and so they were all very happy with the other ones. So I think you've seen, I've had my definition of religion posted here, and I have updated it somewhat. A lot of the links were screwed up, but I fixed them. But the main thing I wanted to emphasize is that my definition of religion comes from a sociological perspective, and basically avoids the issue of suggesting that there's a particular definition of religion that fits only something like Christianity or the religions of the book. So, for example, there's no emphasis on the idea that God is believed to exist or not, but rather, if we look at what William James might have found in his varieties of the religious experience, is psychologically believing in a big picture that gives our lives meaning as the main characteristic of religion. And it also socially stabilizes the community when you have everyone believing that same picture. And that, in fact, is one of what the sociologists will emphasize, is that it's the socially stabilizing set of beliefs that cohere a community around those basic principles and things. And so believing that is essentially what religion is in this perspective. And this, if you ever get the chance, I have lots of fun things I do with this. Something I've probably talked about is Miroslav Volf's Flourishing book, which just came out, and I brought it today in case anybody wants to look at it. I have 3 bookmarkers in here. Actually, yeah, well, 2 now. I took the flat, my daughter uses the flat, so I took that out and I put this in there. And I don't know why this one is, oh, that's the end, so that's the notes. If you'd like to take a look at this, I'll pass this around. Just came out, and he, I think I mentioned, is originally from Yugoslavia. He's actually Episcopalian now, which is odd because you wouldn't have had the opportunity to grow up and be Episcopalian if you were from Yugoslavia, but as far as I understand it, he's Yugoslavian now, or he's Episcopalian now. And he taught a joint class at Yale with Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister. So, and their concern is the world religions, how they're shaping our lives, affecting everything from the public policies of political leaders and the economic decisions of industry bosses and employees to university curricula, all the way to the inner longings of our hearts. Integral to both globalization and religions are compelling, overlapping, and sometimes competing visions of what it means to live well. So he's trying to really gather a lot of folks all over the world from all the different religions into some kind of a religious council, so that basically the number one, we recognize that religions are necessary for world flourishing because we need that kind of social stability. We need that kind of software installed on people in order for them to cooperate with one another. You know, if you think of it that way, that's absolutely essential to a coherent society. So that's all good social science, actually, right? So it's not like you've got religion confronting, science, and there's a great big conflict. There's actually no conflict whatsoever. This is much more of a social science approach, and I see that pretty much with all of the scholars associated with the great religions. And so he's trying to organize some sort of worldwide council that will basically help kind of license who gets to be authorities in religion, and so that we can some way move away from the fundamentalist groups, the imams that encourage their young men to go out and kill people. I don't know if you're aware that they just arrested an imam in Europe who was kind of a key individual to all of the recent attacks in Europe. They've identified all the young men that were involved in, like, the Paris shooting recently, the Brussels airport, the Charlie Hebdo attacks. They all have one thing in common. They were all students of the same imam, who himself hasn't done anything illegal except to encourage all of these young men to basically kill and attack everyone in the European status quo. So it's individuals like that that are professing a particular religious creed that is totally disruptive of the social necessities that we have for religion. So they're interested basically in combating that problem by in a sense, somehow establishing some kind of a worldwide religious authority system that licenses who gets to preach, and basically will try to stop those that are not meeting the basic criteria. And in a sense, France has already done this. France requires people who are imams that profess in the mosques of what Islam teaches. They are required to take classes in France on secularism, laïté, they call it in France, to make sure that they understand that they cannot teach things that are contrary to the secular beliefs of France, which, by the way, are much more rigorous than what we have here. So, for example, we have a lot of preachers here that are perfectly fine. You grab whatever book you feel is your essential wisdom, and you go out and you preach to people, and if you end up with 15 or more basically coming to listen to you every week, you could write your house as a tax write-off, call it a church, and establish your own church, and there you go. And no one will complain, except maybe the neighbors when everybody comes to park on Sundays. at your house. We don't require people like that to take a course and be licensed to be a preacher. We have so much of a tradition separating church and state that I can't imagine that eventually happening. France does not have that, and yet we think of France as such a liberal state where liberté is literally simultaneously sort of invented along with the United States. The revolutions were very close. 1776, 1789, that's pretty close. Right? So that's all interesting, I think. So I argue that for this perspective on what religion is, it's belief in a meta-narrative. And notice that it doesn't have to be associated with what we traditionally call religion, right, as you'll see. But it does have to answer these questions. And this comes from Peter Berger in his Socially Constructed Reality. It has to answer the questions, who am I? So I have to have myself defined by my beliefs, right? I have to know who I am. And what my place is in the universe, that's my role, basically, and how I maintain that place, so how I succeed in playing that role, what behaviors I need to learn, and how I have to act in society. So, and you can see why those three roles all have to be somewhat proximate in a society for us to all cooperate. We have to have a team effort. It's a social relationship. So monotheism itself, and by the way, these links, if you're curious, notice it's just on my website, are usually to explanations of what that word is if you're not familiar with it. But we typically say of monotheism, belief in only one ultimate organizing intelligence in the universe, whether it's the universe itself, perhaps, or a tripartite God. So the Trinitarians in the Christian tradition always use the symbol of the triangle to represent that, because the triangle is one thing, but at the same time it has 3 points. And the emphasis on that is that, well, thanks to that triangularity, you could have the Father love the Son and the Father love one another and the world. And so basically you end up with the possibility of this divine unity of intelligence loving. And so the Christian essence of the divine is love, which, arguing that other conceptions of a monotheistic divinity do not permit, because that single individual cannot be dependent on anything else. And so love is usually not part of it. That's one of the critiques that a lot of folks make of Islam and even Judaism. However, monotheism itself, unity of really the absolutes. So if you think about it, this is where absolutism comes from. And remember, in History of Philosophy 1, I argue that it seems to me that the monotheism as a belief system developed in relationship with the mathematics of Egypt, where they ended up realizing, gee, if you have an all-powerful something, and it's more powerful than everything else, you can't have a multiplicity of them, because by definition there can only be one. So that's a mathematical concept. And so it seems like Akhenaten basically developed that at about a time where mathematics had clearly developed well enough in Egypt that it, in a sense, changed the way people thought about differences in points of view. Mathematics doesn't allow a different point of view. 1 + 1 = 2, and if you disagree with me, I'll kill you. basically, right? That's how that works. So the meaning of a word comes from the context and is decided by those who are trained to interpret the meanings in the context. A monotheistic meta-narrative would answer the three major questions by describing a grand unified theory. That's what Stephen Hawking talks about. Grand unified theory, right? That puts everything all together. So that's actually a monotheistic meta-narrative by definition, with the answer to why everything is the way it is. By the way, Plato conjectures in the Timaeus. Remember, in the Timaeus, he argues God has, and this comes from the Egyptians, actually, that God has to be outside of time and space. So it can't be a creature that evolves and becomes powerful in the world, because that wouldn't explain how the world got to be here in the first place. So the Big Bang can't be part of the nature of the cosmos, except from the point of view of that's how it got started. So notice this is also basically the point of Brian Greene in his explanation of the universe, and I have a link to one of his, I think this is a TED Talk for Brian Greene, if you're interested in him. Leotard argues that the postmodern crisis results from people no longer believing in meta-narratives. So one of the French postmodernists argues that a crisis in the world is because of all the conflicts in meta-narratives, and when we think about people like Nietzsche and even Kierkegaard, representing the idea that all these narratives are man-made, so none of them are believable, none of them are really true, and as a result you end up with this crisis. No one believes any of them, because by definition they're man-made. They're not true or false. They're competitive meta-narratives. What makes a really good one? Well, maybe the monomyth, right? Of Joseph Campbell, that we apparently statistically all like the monomyth, right? By the way, apparently a new Harry Potter movie. It's not Harry Potter. It's Fantastic Beasts. I saw the trailer. It looks pretty cool, actually. Clearly, we're going to have some new toys for my office as a result of this new movie. A suitcase, probably with fingernails coming out of it, I guess. But it has to be Muggle ready, right? You have to. I don't know if you've seen it. Well, so the interesting thing about Leotard's book, the postmodern, what is it called? The Postmodern Condition, which I think this actually links to. Oh, okay, so that's just Amazon. But there are sites on the web that has this whole thing, so you don't have to buy it. Wow, why is that so expensive? It should be really cheap. So Leotard's argument is that this has created a crisis of knowledge, because, by the way, your meta-narrative that you believe in establishes the criterion by which everything else in your knowledge is arranged. So if you don't have a basic meta-narrative that you believe, you can end up very existential, European, and individualistic, focused on yourself as an individual and not connecting yourself to your society. So instead of being a we, we're an I, and we're all each in it for ourselves and competing, etc. So end result is we're not interested in having children. We're more selfish, etc. By the way, if you had a chance to see Pope Francis's new encyclical, which just came out last week, The Joy of the Family, that's a big part of what he's talking about, is that this crisis is still here with regard to our selfish, individual, Western worldview, which makes it very difficult for our society to function well as a society, especially with regard to families, because if you're a selfish, self-centered individual, narcissistic individual, I'm not talking about Trump, of course, I'm just in general, you're not interested in having children because they're expensive, take away from your opportunity to have fun for yourself, because you end up with obligations, both time and wealth, in order to raise children. And think about we, the people, instead of just you yourself. But what's interesting about Lyotard's book to me was Frederick Jamison, no relationship, is the one who writes the introduction to that book, the English publication. And guess what? He says, and of course, Lyotard is wrong about this, because what Lyotard is promoting, this conception of postmodernism, the idea that meta-narratives are dead, is itself an example of such a meta-narrative. So Lyotard's creating a meta-narrative, a grand narrative himself, by talking about all meta-narratives as, in a sense, scientifically studied by us. And we can define certain characteristics of them very exactly the way I'm doing. It's very much actually influenced by Lyotard. It's very difficult for you to believe the meta-narrative when you think they're all man-made and created in order to keep us all in line. So which one keeps us in line best? Well, maybe I don't want to be kept in line. Maybe I want to rebel, etc. I point out that an awful lot of people I know here in town will argue that they're not religious, but they're spiritual. But I'm not necessarily sure that there's a big difference between the way they're using the concept of spirituality and religion. They're still essentially believing some sort of meta-narrative with regard to what it means to be human, etc. So they might be shying away from association with certain religious institutions by saying that, but nonetheless you could tell there's still this essential need for an explanation of why we are here. And these can help identify the culture. I refer here to Pope Benedict's book, Truth and Tolerance, which is one of my favorites of his, which I think is really remarkable. And he talks about all this too, how important it is for the meta-narrative to hold us together. And he also argues why he thinks the Christian meta-narrative is better than the other major competitor that he feels there is, and that's Buddhism. And he feels that the main difference between them is that Buddhism doesn't have an other. It defines the universe as all there is, whereas Christianity defines this other as something that we have a relationship with, and that could be explained as love. Notice I have this example of Conan here. I won't play it because you're all familiar with it, because that's the link to Conan the Barbarian, the musical, etc. Which was funny. I thought that would be absolutely hilarious, and it just hit them like a ton of bricks. None of them reacted. I was absolutely horrified. How could you not laugh at that? However, that was the result I got at that particular time. So there's two things to notice, though, in Conan the Barbarian, specifically the musical, right? Is that there is a meta-narrative that answers the three questions and teaches an ethical norm. Remember, kill your enemies, as, see them crushed or whatever before you, and then hear the lamentations of their women, right? So that's a meta-narrative. My job is to take my sword and cut the heads off as many of these enemies as possible, right? And second, that in actuality, the piece is a satire, of course, for a postmodern audience who should laugh at the ridiculous nature of the ethics shown, even though there are many people living today, ISIS, who live that way. That's one of those horrible things. Conan the Barbarian may very well be still the norm for more people in the world than those that we think of as modern. I don't know how you would measure that, especially since they ought to be killing one another off pretty quickly if that's the case. And they are, actually. I don't know how there can still be ISIS people when we've been blowing them up for all this time. It's kind of amazing. Mostly because Europeans keep still going to join. And it's pretty darn interesting to hear the allure of why that is. And by the way, the main explanation that people tend to give, especially in France, is that the young men that are attracted to ISIS grow up in France with no believable meta-narrative. So they have no meaning in their lives, and then they hear this call from the media in ISIS, and it's so attractive because it offers a meta-narrative that they can believe in, and so they leave to join and become part of that horrific caliphate because of it offering them a believable meta-narrative. So that's pretty interesting. But yes, of course, the Conan the Barbarian, the musical, is a satire on those narratives. That I think would be hard for someone to really believe that that is the real ethical norm after watching that. It becomes absolutely ridiculous. So the ethical position in the meta-narrative, kill your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of the women, is fairly sophisticated, actually, the way that video is made. If we look at still earlier templates for this, we can see the basic hunting narratives, etc. As Vine Deloria. Vine Deloria is a terrific author. I think he was Navajo? I forget. He's dead now. His son writes also, so you'll see other Delorias out there in publication. But Vine Deloria was a main part of the National Museum for the American Indian and other things. But so Vine Deloria explains the gather-hunter meta-narratives teach traditions that enable natives to live in a particular place and subsist in cooperation with the animals and plants of that environment. It's interesting to me that Kristen is doing her book presentation today, because the title of her book is somewhat associated with exactly this issue, and the conflict of narratives, because here you have a hunter-gatherer tradition whose main religious narratives, if you think of it, they're not monotheistic. They're primarily tales of how you cooperate with your environment so that you can survive, right? How the community needs to cooperate together, right? So that's the level of sophistication of such a narrative. It's not a very complex society, relatively speaking, compared to, say, the Byzantine Empire, right? And so in comes this much more complex society imposing its meta-narrative, as confused as it is, on this community. And it's translated, obviously, into some sort of a language that they can understand. And yet I would think that it's essentially untranslatable, in the same way that the Samoan person can't figure out why there's so many words for child, when in Samoan there's only one. We have 15 or 20. What the heck? How can you understand all the nuances of all that? I would imagine that the scriptural translation of the Bible into Nupiaq is what? What on earth? And Samoan, too, is another example. How do you do that? I bet it's really a very, very different book. Wonder if this is a link to God is Red. Yeah, God is Red. It's a terrific book. I found that book, by the way, when I was spending a week in one of the villages, and it was in the school library, and I was the only one reading in the library. And when I found that book and I shared it with some of the high school students there, they were all amazed that there was such a book there, but actually it didn't encourage them to read anything. They had this library that had been donated by people who wanted to help the village out, and number one, they learned as a rule, you could not allow anyone to check out the books, because any books that were checked out became firewood or use some, and there's no culture that said, okay, so you check the book out and you bring it back. By the way, I found that kind of an interesting dilemma here too. As you know, I lend out books in my library for you to read. And it's interesting to me that over the years I've discovered certain types of individuals never bring them back. And so I've actually learned not to lend them to certain. I know that's kind of evil to think that way, but if you don't want to lose them, you know, you have to.
Is that why you said no?
To who? Did I say no to you? No. I have that book, by the way, if you're interested. Although it's in my garage, I think, so I might not be able to find it. What we need to do is have the whole class go to my garage and go through it and see if we can find all these books that.
That could be our final. Just come and clean
And we
the
can,
house.
I'm not, you know, well, actually, I don't have a grill anymore. I'll make sandwiches. But you'll be absolutely appalled. Say, no, you think that I must have a really neat house. It's totally false. I can't afford servants. We do not have a house elf. My wife doesn't believe in housework. So actually, our house looks like a family has lived there for 27 years and not cleaned anything. You know, so that's would be appalling, I suppose. These stories typically are much more basic than the model of the mythical narratives described by Joseph Campbell. Although, of course, he traces them back to that. If we go back to the Greek myths, the hunter narratives in the Greeks, and I think I mentioned my colleague Jim Lischka did a book on the semiotic of myth, where he basically traces a lot of our contemporary myths back to Greece, and as part of that book, traces native Alaskan myths all the way back to Greece. The semiotic of myth. George Lucas, of course, mentioned Campbell, called him my Yoda. And Star Wars does play out a perfect example of this. And notice here, I think I've mentioned Beverly Hills Chihuahua to you guys as one of the scariest movies out there because it's a satire on the monomyth. So that's kind of scary, right? Because you have a cutesy little Chihuahua voiced by what's her face? Who's the actress? I forget.
Welcome to the home of the rich and famous.
I'll get you anything you want. Yes, I will. No, not you, Patrick.
Where no one is more pampered and privileged than the Beverly Hills Chihuahuas.
It's not easy to find a mate with papers. Hey, talk to the pop.
But Poppy is the one dog who's his own man.
Oh, lovely. Who is that hunky Chihuahua?
So who's the actress that does the Chloe?
Is it Drew Barrymore?
Drew Barrymore, thank you.
I'm about to entrust you with my greatest treasure. You take good care of her.
Wake up! Come on!
Oh, well, she did, but everything is about
Never do that to a Chihuahua.
Mexico! Hola and adios.
So she's in Mexico and she gets away.
The most pampered dog in Beverly Hills is 1,000 miles from home.
Don't you speak any Spanish?
Why would I speak Spanish?
Hello, you're Chihuahua, mija.
And this rebel and his crew
So it's racist too.
are on a mission that's off the leash.
I'm gonna kick some tail. Who's gonna eat me? I got a wife and 300 kids to feed.
Racism. Right? That's not just a mouse, that's a Spanish mouse, a Mexican mouse.
Let's get out of here.
Walt Disney Pictures presents
I could use a little help.
the greatest Chihuahua movie
Oh, yeah.
of all time.
Yeah, homie. I have never had
How many of these are there now? There's like 4 or 5 of them, isn't there? They keep making them and people will pay for more. Let's give them more.
I want to talk to Chloe. Would you put her on? Hi, honey.
2?
There's at least 3.
Chihuahua.
It's offensive
Wait.
and it's racist, but I mean, it's hard to have humor and comedy without being offensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's-
Hillary Clinton just discovered that the other day. And I learned, I didn't know, CP time. Did you hear the frou-frou over that? Apparently the mayor of New York who's, referred to, well, we're on CP time here. And that, I guess, is a reference to colored people time, as if you're late, right? And that's like, oh, that's no, you don't do that. But then Hillary, I guess, tried to pull the fat out of the fire by saying, yes, current political time. CP.
Cautious politician time, is what she said, yeah.
Oh well, you're tough. That's so tough. So notice again, that movie Beverly Hills Chihuahua is postmodernist. We're laughing at this satire, what appears to be the tried and true template of the hero's quest. Chloe sacrifices herself to her friends, but is resurrected as the light hits the stone she lies on dead in the cave. As far as I know, no critics made fun of this movie, making fun of Jesus' resurrection.
With the chihuahua.
With a chihuahua. And Diablo, the devil, right? But by the way, again, when I presented this to that 60 people crowd, not a single person there had ever seen the movie. In fact, I'm not sure any of them had ever seen a movie. And they just totally did not react. And yet I think that's incredibly hilarious if you've never thought of it. So mathematics, Greek for knowledge, when we look at the evolution of religious structure, I think see the main movement to monotheism following mathematics. So remember, my presentation is on what monotheism is. So once the priesthood develops math, we see it moving all these ways. Narrow the field to just one most powerful, and then only one God. Small g. Apparently we have Akhenaten's attempt to do away with the polytheistic priesthood. Did I show you the Philip Glass opera, Akhenaten?
Yes.
I should. I'm not going to play that now, but that's absolutely. Did I show that?
You
I
should.
don't think so. I don't have a link to that because it wasn't. That opera didn't exist at the time I gave that presentation, as far as. And I want the temple scene. So this is just one of the scenes in Philip Glass's opera Akhenaten. And this is the scene where Akhenaten decides to destroy the polytheistic gods of Egypt. But it's also Philip Glass, so if you're not familiar with Philip Glass, his music is... Remember the movie The Hours? The perfect example. So that's Akhenaten, who's a countertenor, by the way, in the piece. So he's got the highest voice there. That's his mother on the left and his wife on the right. Or is it the opposite? Mother, wife. His wife is Nefertiti. Of this is you don't have to know what language it's in because it's in all languages. Because there's no actual words, they're just arguing with one another by saying ha ha ha. Notice notice it just keeps up. That's 10 minutes I just covered, right? And notice that's the high priest of Amun Ra. So he's the one that's being insulted most by this. So he takes the one God and he will smash it. By the way, this is historical. He actually destroyed the Amun Ra temple. Took the roof off of it so that the sun could shine in it. So. But remember, they did kill him and put his son Tutankhamun on the throne, which enabled them to rebuild the polytheistic religions. It's really quite interesting, actually, what happened. And also, by the way, a lot of people argue that it's his priesthood who were the monotheists that fled Egypt, and that was actually the Hebrews, the source of where the Hebrew. And Moses would be then, Moshe would be, the leader of that. So that's pretty interesting. And there is a book by Jan Assman, Moses the Egyptian, that's fairly old, 1998. And he uses Freud as his main narrative to explain that. So this takes us to Plato, the different dialogues. Euthyphro is especially the one that seems to be considered to have destroyed kind of a non-critical, non-rational belief in a religious authority by posing the question, is the good good because the gods love it, or is the good good and that's why the gods love it, right? So if you're posed with that question, you realize that if you have a priesthood class that tells you this is what God wants you to do. Remember, I love asking the question, if Jesus comes to your door, asks you to sell everything you have, come follow him, do you go? Or do you ask questions like, hey, wait a minute, how's this a good economic model? How's that going to work for the whole society? If you're a mother, do you bring your child? What about the stroller? You need stuff to raise a child. You can't just sell everything. So as Americans, we're trained to question authority. So in that interesting context, how do you handle an authority that you absolutely know is Jesus? He comes to your door and he wants you to do stuff, and you're like, no, I don't want to do that. Do you argue with Jesus? So Euthyphro is a very powerful argument there. So what occurs here is the priority of reason, establishing what is pious over the claim of the priesthood. That what is pious is what they claim the God loves. What is mathematically obvious is that there can only be one highest good. The problem is, how do we come to know what that is, right? Notice the reference to the ontological argument is a good argument for that. And I also have a link to Gödel, who's got the more contemporary mathematical version of that argument. And notice Gödel is considered by everyone to have been a Platonist, and good mathematicians are, actually. So I consider this a successful proof, but there are critiques, etc. I mentioned Kant. And the language games of God, which brings up Wittgenstein. Pope Benedict uses this theory to explain the Trinity. I have this interesting link. So this is just an interesting link on the web about all the different religions, not all of them, but quite a few of them, and their relationships all the way back. Also mentioned interactive ritual chains. That's Randall Collins again, who I mentioned in the Sociology of Philosophies. and Aquinas, and how he compromises the clash between the religious authority, faith, and reason as the two wings on which we fly. So monotheism then is the belief that there's only one God, but not monodeism. In this we see the religions of the book, Torah, Bible, Quran, as in agreement. There is one God. The language games that have developed to enhance the meaning of the concept of God are where there are differences. But the one God of Judaism is the one God of Christianity, and that God is Allah in Arabic. We've talked a little bit about that. I mentioned Tariq Ramadan, who I've been reading his stuff for years, and he's clearly evolved himself and become, I think, much more moderate. Initially, when I started reading his stuff, even though he was the head professor in Oxford, the dawn of Islamic studies, he was nonetheless very radical, I thought, and talking outright about Islam eventually taking over Europe. And the way we do it is everybody move here, have lots of children, and sooner or later there will be more of us than the Europeans, and so Islam will literally become the religion of Europe. But today he's much more moderate. And part of the rituals that he talks about there don't seem to have anything to do with the basic narrative of monotheism, but instead are cultural norms that come from weird places where it might actually make sense to kill your daughter because she had sex with someone you didn't approve of. Imagine that. Dennis Turner was there that year that I gave this presentation, and a lot of people I thought would have been at his presentation too. And his interesting argument was that a contemporary monotheist theologian would in a sense be exactly in the same position as an atheist, because you can't say anything about that God, apart from that God must exist by definition, because God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, and so it must exist, otherwise it's not that. And so God is the only thing that by necessity has an essence that extends to his or her, its existence. And John Hare was another that we had, in fact, that year from Yale, and his topic, as I recall, was pretty darn similar. It's interesting that they're all thinking about well, I guess he's not there any longer. I also mentioned Sam Harris, because I'm expecting this group to all be familiar with the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which is Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens. May his name be praised, etc. I wonder if that would make him turn over in his grave to hear me give him an Islamic honorific every time I mention his passing. You know, when you say Muhammad, you're supposed to say, may his name be praised, etc. So I thought, is that an insult to them to refer to Christopher Hitchens and say, may his name be praised? That would... Because he was an atheist. Yes. And Sam Harris is one of those that in his one book claims to be spiritual. So that's kind of different. So he's spiritual but not religious. So Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett join Harris in his argument. So here's kind of the plot to my little presentation here. What is current monotheism today? I would argue that these guys actually represent the new monotheism. The new monotheism is voiced as a militant, almost, atheism, and that science rules. But notice it becomes, in a sense, the new socially coherent meta-narrative that we all should accept as true. So it actually qualifies sociologically as a meta-narrative, and they want everyone to believe it. So they're actively trying to convert everyone to believe their atheistic scientific narrative, because they feel like that will actually do away with religious violence. So basically, their behavior is exactly the same as any new religious group that are literally proselytizing and trying to tell everyone how their religion is going to save the world. So we assume the best religious practice for people in a particular environment should be something we could determine. I can't recall exactly why I was thinking DARPA would be into this, but actually if you think about DARPA, they are trying to figure out how to use mind control through the internet. So they're actively studying how they can identify individuals that are their interests, their mental models, so to speak, are or similar to those kinds of models that create havoc. You know, so the terrorists, for example, that would blow up a school and things of that sort. How can we figure out from their media use, just by using the metadata, right, that's available to a place like the NSA, how can we figure out, aha, this person is guilty by association of the network that he's connected to, maybe the very kinds of terms that he uses frequently, the frequency of usage of those, and so on. You know, so if you're worried that you're on Facebook and you say, oh, terrorism, I think I'm going to blow up such and such. Whoa, you think the FBI will catch your reference? I would hope so. That means that they've got some, obviously not individuals sitting there. I used to do that, so I know that incredibly time-consuming to have an individual sitting there listening to stuff. I'm sure that's not the way it's done today. It's clearly done by computers that are monitoring just the way Shazam can tell you what music is playing within seconds, And it also will tell you what you're saying, if you think about it. So we've got programs out there that monitor, I'm sure, the media and know, but not that some individual is sitting there and saying, ha, Lorenzo is doing such and such. No. But if you say, hey, I'm going to blow up the school, I'm so angry, the algorithm will say, whoa, danger, danger. Everybody is to get off the street, that kind of thing. Sorry, that's the Russians are coming reference. So DARPA is definitely trying to figure this stuff out. DARPA is the, I always forget what it's, anybody remember what defense, I forget. They're the ones that are using technology to try to save the world against terrorism and any other enemies of the United States, foreign and domestic. DARPA. So visualizing and understanding the spatiotemporal, what a great word, dynamics, God bless you, of global diffusion of ideas and the semantic web too. So that's whatever they're talking about, right? This is actually from that text, I believe. Involves a process typical of advanced DCS, ontology formation, web search, data return, and an analysis, pattern identification, ontology refinement, or, one sub-goal. That's the same thing, right? So that's a specific part in that text, I guess. It occurs to me that bishops Ambrose and Augustine might have found such analysis useful in their conflicts. Remember, they were, I mentioned the Font of Life by Barry Willis, where they were in conflict with the emperor in Milan, but they won. So that's very interesting. Although, of course, later on, Augustine was killed by terrorists, basically, same thing, attacking his town. But what is the dominant monotheism today? Watching Richard Dawkins several summers ago at UAF, it was obvious to me that he was a very religious man by my definition, and his followers were very religious as well. It was like an atheist church service. You had to be there if you're familiar with church services, even the kind where people stand on their feet and you know are chanting hymns and stuff. Basically, that was it. That was it. His lecture had the atmosphere of a sacred service. Is also clearly monotheistic, though confused about a great many things. That's where Alistair McGrath, I think, is absolutely wonderful. If you're familiar with him and his dialogues with Richard Dawkins, his books about it, because McGrath is a theologian as well as a biologist and a international studies professor. So McGrath goes to great length to help clarify things for him in his series of videos, which probably are still here. Nope, thanks. Which brings me to a terrific interpretation of our contemporary postmodern monotheism and the interactive rituals that have developed, especially among our young people. Slavoj Žižek would be one, but Gangnam, how do I... You recognize the singer? Pardon? You can make those too. But beware, once you make one, then they keep emailing you to tell you about the newest songs that you could, right? Because all you have to do is take your face or whatever and put it into the, and then they add it to the video, and then you can email it to your friends and post it on the web. Absolutely crazy. But is that part of our contemporary postmodern monotheism? We make fun. We make fun of all this stuff. In fact, in logic class, I'll argue that one of the reasons that we're so much into humor is because that's almost our contemporary religious service. If you think about what the point of a religious service is, it's to give the individuals that are attending the opportunity to feel an ecstasis, an ecstasy, right? Where you feel outside of the world looking at it, right? So it puts you in a position where you're outside of the norm, looking at the norm in a way where your meta-narrative is so obvious to you because you're seeing the world in this big picture, right? You know, so in the sacred place, you're in the church, you hear the sacred music, you smell the sacred scents, everyone's dressed to the nines, so to speak. You know, they have secret music, special sacred chants, and so on. So you just feel like you're uplifted, right? That's even the expression we use. You're taken out of the mundane and into the eternal momentarily for an hour. But that refreshes you because it reinforces your meta-narrative, and now you can come back into the world, but you've got that in your mind that there's the eternal outside of all of this misery of everyday life that I can kind of resort to whenever I want to. heck, no, I never wanted to leave it. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a priest because I loved being in that sacred space. It was much more miserable being in the mundane world, so I wanted to find some way of staying in that. Well, today, if you don't believe any of the meta-narratives, something like Beverly Hills Chihuahua, where you're laughing at everyone else's meta-narrative, and humor in general is where we step momentarily out of the world and laugh at everybody's human foibles, right? So in a sense, and notice, by the way, even though there's certainly humor, like the Greeks have some plays, Lysistrata, the frogs, and so on, and there's clearly humor even in Egypt. I think I've mentioned, I have a book on ancient humor where you can see pictures of the baboon leading the oarsman, so obvious, well, it seems like it could be funny, right? So obviously we've had humor all along, but we've never had stand-up comedy where you have literally a show person who will stand there on stage in front of 1,000 people or so and basically make them laugh for a whole hour. Are we finished?
No, I have an interview in 10 minutes.
Good luck, good luck.
Thank you.
But so if you think of it, that's like in the areas where postmodernism has taken root and young people don't believe in any of the traditional meta-narratives, this becomes like our religious service. So Gangnam Style, and Slavoj Žižek is a philosopher that basically makes fun. This is a almost 2-hour lecture, so I'll just play. You've seen Slavoj, right?
If we engage in some mythical genealogy and try to guess what's the origin of Hitler, of World War II, it's Father Joseph. You know why? This was the battle between Catholics, Protestants for Europe. But Cardinal Richelieu had no illusions. He knew it's not really about that. It is about guaranteeing about establishing central role of France in European politics, and the way to do it is to prevent German unification.
So Slavoj, excellent, fluent speaker of the postmodern narrative. So if you want to become a fluent speaker yourself, you listen to him for a while. Unfortunately, you also pick up a tick, and you want to start wearing dirty t-shirts and grow a beard and look ugly like me, which might be a generational thing. I think he's about a year older than me. Robert Putnam has a book called American Grace. I believe that was his latest one. An earlier book, the one that made him famous, was Bowling Alone, which again talks about the crisis of the postmodern situation where every individual becomes specifically that, an individual, and it's up to you to make your own meaning, and we fail miserably at doing that when we're alone, because we need that sociality of reason to create viable meta-narratives. So Bowling Alone was a scary thing because it pointed out, well, my parents' generation used to bowl in teams. Now, if we're bowling at all, we're bowling by ourselves. We don't bowl in teams. In fact, it's, of course, way worse than that because we're at home. There's even more interesting studies about that, how everybody goes home, and there's so much at home. We don't need to go out to places because we can do everything right there at home. So we're even more individualistic in our lifestyle. But he's also saying that America has solved the puzzle of religious pluralism by creating a web of interlocking personal relationships among people of many different faiths. So this is America's grace. And so you could see, like, our town, we have councils of churches in our town where the ministers and other members of the various churches all come together and try to arrange how the churches can cooperate on things like homelessness or whatever, right? So we're no problem with having people of a lot of different faiths disagreements in what they actually believe, but still the main principles are still there. And Stephen Jay Gould, I think, it's a shame we lost him. He was just in his early 60s when he died, but he was a much better biologist than Richard Dawkins, I think. And in talking about this, Stephen Jay Gould did not talk about how we, the God delusion, how can we, get rid of God, because that'll make everything better. Instead, Stephen Jay Gould argued that there are two non-overlapping magisteria. Non-overlapping. The one is religion, and the other one is science. And religion deals with the rock of ages, and science deals with the ages of rocks. Religion deals with how to get to heaven, and science deals with how the heavens go. Right? So there are two non-overlapping magisteria. So they're in charge. So science is in charge of the physical world, and religion is in charge of meaning in our lives. This is a great little book on that, Science and Religion in the Fullness of Life. Notice that this is, in a sense, an activist update on how we can fix some of the problems we have.
Yeah, I saw your presentation. Mine's not so dead.
We need the meta-narratives, but we need some sort of coherence. To end this, by the way, I have, are we finished? A minute or two? If you get the chance, this is a presentation, the video of Dr. Gay's presentation on Protestantism. But he is really excellent.
This is what I think you ought to do. I think a lot of students are illiterate as to the differences between Presbyterians and Methodists and Catholics. So I'd like you to help them understand those differences. And I said, well, of course, I would like to do that, but don't you think it might be appropriate, seeing as how we are located where we are, that the students know something about the religions of the world, so that when we get to Christianity, which of course we will, then we can talk about the Presbyterians and the others. Well, he said, probably a good idea. So that's how, of course, in what was then called man's religion, which he pushed into today.
So Dr. Gay was a professor and the chaplain of Ohio Wesleyan University when he was invited by the Board of Regents, who was building a new university in Alaska called Alaska Methodist University. He was invited to come up and be the chaplain and philosophy professor here. So he gave up tenure and everything else in a huge place down there and came up here when the buildings hadn't even been built yet, and so on. And he moved up here, and he ended up being the vice president of the university and a professor of both philosophy and theology for many years, till the university basically went under because of funding problems. Methodism, the Methodists overextended themselves and underfunded themselves, so the university collapsed. Not just here, all of them, I think, collapsed. And so, of course, it's now Alaska Pacific University.